Welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. So excited to have all of you joining us. We are going to be having the third part of our special series, Navigating the Social Determinants of Mental Health, taught by Alec Stratford, Executive Director and Registrar of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, and also one of my personal teachers and sources of inspiration and role models. So grateful to have a chance to learn from him and learn from all of you as we engage in dialogue together. But first, let us begin with a land acknowledgement, which means let's first ground ourselves in this planet. Take a look outside if you can. If you have a picture of a beautiful place where you can be grounding, take a moment to take a deep breath and arrive and be present and centered. And please join in the chat and acknowledge the name of where you are located. So placenames.mapdev.ca is a phenomenal resource because it's interactive. You can zero in on the specific town where you're located, and it even teaches you how to pronounce it as we begin to learn the language of the land where we are. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. When we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truths. And so in light of this, I'm going to now stop my screen share and I'm going to hand it over to Alec, who is going to teach us, and I look forward to learning. So welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for joining us at lunch. Just let me bring my slides up, and then I'll be happy to begin. This is a continuation of our talk that we had a couple of weeks ago on the social determinants of health. Are folks seeing the right screen?
Yes, we see
Okay.
lunch and learn number 2, which I
Perfect.
apologize. I lost track of time. It's 2, not 3. So stay tuned, everyone.
This is number 2. Yeah. This is number 2. What we're going to do is we talked about what the social determinants of mental health were in the first series. Today, we're going to talk about the policies that would actually bring to life the social determinants of mental health. And then our third sessions, we'll talk about the political strategies and tactics that we need to actually create these policies and put them into place. But today I love policy. It's certainly my area of study. When we talk about love languages, one of my mentors and friends, Christine Saunier with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, when we're talking about a lot of work, has a T-shirt that I think speaks to this well, which is that policy is my love language. The reality is that if we have policy is an expression of human connection and how we relate to one another. And when we put policies in place that actually are designed to create well-being, to create connectivity, again, our fulfillment, our well-being start to change quite radically. So I want to begin with talking about what do we need to be able to generate the type of policy that we want. And that we desperately need. Certainly, we spent a lot of time in the last workshop talking about, the advent of neoliberalism, the core values that it holds, individualism, market-driven forces, and how that has created the context for us to not be well as a society, for us not to be connected. So the challenge becomes, so what do we look for? How do we create policy? And this brought us to the table with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives a number of years ago now. I believe 2020 is when we actually, the day that we launched this report was the day that a global pandemic was announced, which was interesting as we started to unfold on where we needed to go. And what we created was a social policy framework. Again, the framework in which policy needs to be addressed or challenged by or marked by in order to ensure that we're addressing inequality and equity and ultimately the social determinants of health. I'm not going to go into much detail about each of these principles right now. Naj organized a really great presentation for Advocacy Day a couple of years ago that is on our YouTube page that goes through each of these interconnected points in much more detail in terms of what each represents and what it looks like in policy. But ultimately, again, the idea of this is that it's a roadmap. It's grounded in how do we get to where we need to go. Ultimately, the center of that is evidence-based and intersectional thinking. And then again, 10 policy principles, including things like universality, climate justice, public provision, that needs to be thought about when we're thinking about our public policy. So in terms of the policies that are needed to address the social determinants of mental health, we do need to, as most things do, look at our fiscal framework. Ultimately, when we're looking at public policy, Joe Biden certainly has weaknesses and strengths, but one of the strengths that I think, or one of the notions that Joe Biden has is this attitude and this quote that I use quite a bit, which is Joe Biden is famous for saying, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." From a public policy perspective, this is really fundamentally important. How we tax, how we spend really sets our values and our priorities. And there's a lot of myths in Nova Scotia about our fiscal framework, such as we're an overtaxed jurisdiction. Even the narrative that you see neoliberal proponents pushing that somehow taxes are contributing to inflation, that it is taxes that is making life unaffordable. These are all neoliberal myths. The reality is that we've made specific political choices that have benefited a small group of people around how we tax and how we spend. So again, in order to really deliver on the social determinants of mental health, we have to address our fiscal framework, and we have to address it in a way that is much more significantly aligned with our overall well-being. For instance, again, Nova Scotia has, although we tout ourselves as having a progressive tax system, it ain't all that progressive. The reality is that proportionally, if you are rich, you have lots of ways to not pay your fair share and to get out of paying taxes towards public services. So we need to do things like broaden our tax base, have more tax levels, and make it more progressive so that, again, the top percentage of earners are paying more, the bottom percentage earners are paying less. We can even look at things like capital gains tax. So these are, again, taxes for investments that you may have. Right now, again, you're not taxed at the full value of that. You're taxed at, depending on how much less. And in fact, there's a ton of evidence that demonstrates that capital gains taxing as it exists right now only benefits white men, particularly, that it does not benefit any other group in our society. And that, again, moving to 100% taxing of capital gains, increasing that that tax marginal rate is really important. And then even things like moving from tax deductions to credits, so that, again, it makes for a more progressive system, and the total burden of what someone is paying, particularly on the lower end, is advanced. The other thing that we need to recognize is that we do need to redistribute wealth in a much different way. And part of that report on the social policy framework demonstrated, again, the impact of rising inequality. And rising inequality can be addressed by ensuring a progressive tax system is utilized to then provide services to those who need them the most. So doing things like, again, increasing the mechanism for the affordable living tax credit, the Nova Scotia child benefit. I know at our last lunch and learn, I had been mentioning the living wage being $26, and folks wondering, thought that that ought to be higher. Well, part of what the living wage takes into consideration is also the redistributive measures that we have in our tax system. And so, for instance, the Canadian Child Tax Benefit is an example of this. Those can be extended to better address, again, the social determinants of mental health. And of course, the funding of universal public services. The reality is that income alone, having a higher income, although important, is not the only factor that we need to consider in terms of generating greater well-being. We are much more efficient and effective at undoing the harmful effects of both nihilism and inequality when we pool our resources to provide services that are universally provided. For instance, healthcare is an example of this. We are far more efficient in spending on healthcare publicly than we would if we had a model like the States would have. This can be addressed in a number of other areas as well, in terms of food, housing, even how we build our cities, transportation, that we are much more both cost effective and efficient, and has a bigger impact when we do things collectively rather than relying on individuals to provide all their needs for them. So after we consider, changing our fiscal framework, how decisions are made about our overall health and wellness really ought to be a core decision. Right now, we have a lot of centralized services, a lot of centralized power. When we look at the delivery of healthcare, a number of years ago under the previous Liberal government, there was an amalgamation of the 9 different health districts into one, centralizing control and decision-making power into the hands of a few folks here in Halifax. That's happened similarly with the delivery of child welfare and many of our services. And what we really ought to be talking about is a strengthening of democratic process and how we look at things like, again, shared governance, social inclusion, and who gets to make decisions about the type of care that we receive and where we receive it. So what we need to start to do is look at, again, community decision making around where we place our resources and where we put our effort in, rather than it being piecemeal or grant based. We need to have, again, localized committees made up of, again, first voice, government practitioners, researchers, ultimately the folks that the service is impacting, and put them in the central role of decision making on how we're going to fund various services and various supports. So what I mean by that is, you could look at a community in, let's say, Digby, Nova Scotia. What are the specific needs within Digby that need to be met in terms of that, in terms of services? What kind of family support do we need? What kind of, again, transportation needs? What kind of community events are happening? How do we start to make decisions that are more localized, and who gets to have control over that? Again, using that intersectional and evidence model and moving to increased democratization. The reality is that part of the advent of neoliberalism was that few people are in control of much of our decision making, and that we can start to reverse that trend by looking at localized democratic processes for making decisions on how we spend and pool our public resources to address the social determinants of health in a different way. So again, once we've got the fiscal framework in place and once we have a governance model in place, then we have to start to look at the specific policy tools that we have to address the social determinants of health. There's a lot of ways to do that. And again, in this case, we will focus on, income and wealth distribution. But ultimately, what we do not have in Nova Scotia, and what we do need, is a comprehensive poverty elimination plan with legislated outcome-based targets, timelines, frameworks, something that certainly advocates have been asking for a long time. There's been different iterations of this by different governments, but no one has put a hard target on the elimination of poverty and where we need to go. The current government has talked about this as well, though they talk about it in terms of poverty reduction, not poverty elimination, but clear plans. Again, set the goal. When we set goals, we're ultimately pretty good at achieving them. But until we've set that goal collectively, we're not going to achieve it. We need to do things. We know that things like income assistance is woefully inadequate. We need to be able to raise the level of the social safety net to the poverty line, and that is achievable within a fiscal framework within Nova Scotia. Again, moving things like the Nova Scotia living tax credit, increasing the Nova Scotia child benefit, increasing again that level of income support to a much higher level. I am going to talk about basic income in a minute, so brace for that. But again, when things like income assistance are meant to be basic incomes that we've woefully neglected and denied in terms of creating that support. We also, ultimately, we've spent 10 years fighting to get to $15 minimum wage. Which we're going to get on October 1st. So congrats, everyone. But it's only 10 years too late. And obviously, we've blown by that $15 mark. So again, labor standards, we have to remember that, again, that the private market, again, employers need to do their part here as well, need to be legislated to do that. We have some of the weakest labor standards and codes in all of Canada, not just in terms of pay equity, but in terms of sick leave, even in terms of overtime. You're not legally obligated to pay overtime until a worker has reached 48 hours of work. That's the lowest or the highest in Canada. So really looking closely at our labor standards. And then, of course, again, there's lots that needs to be done in labor standards around the gig economy, the unionization. And again, the reality is that one of the only really proven and effective way of raising wages substantially for folks is unionization, and the capacity for workers to deny their labor for the purposes of again, advancing their wages. And we're seeing some really strong growth. That's the positive thing at this point in time. We're seeing some really strong growth in the union movement in Canada, in the States at this moment in time. Towards that end, so we've seen kind of a resurgence of the need for unions, and again, really pushing for that principle of decent work and well-being. We also, again, when we talk about shared governance, although the provision of social services generally falls within the provinces, the federal government does collect the majority of taxes and has a significant role to play in addressing the social determinants of health. One of the most obvious ones right now that needs to happen is when you look at the provision of CERB that happened during the pandemic. We are still seeing the federal government really target those who have the least capacity to pay back those CERB payments, and really, again, employers who also took the Canadian employment wage subsidy, really no action there. So we need to see amnesty for things like CERB, and we need to ensure that CRA's efforts are directed towards the wealthiest, not the most vulnerable. Again, the role of the public, of the federal government, also needs to be doing things like universal public health care, extending beyond our model as it exists right now, moving to again universal mental health coverage, pharmacare, dental care, vision care, which are often again, in terms of affordability issues, and in terms of the that collective capacity to be able to deliver these issues, really again have a huge impact on affordability issues and our overall health and wellness. I mean, the fact right now that you can get healthcare, but you can't get the medicine prescribed by your doctor covered by that, really points to a fragmented system at this moment in time. And those do a lot in terms of reducing inequality and ensuring that folks have the support that they need. Also, post-secondary education. We know education is a major social determinant of health. Our post-secondary institutions have shifted radically over the last 30 years of neoliberalism has taken over, where post-secondary is now more seen as a commodity, something that you are purchasing rather than a public service. But in terms of that, when you are graduating, certainly tuition is a barrier for accessing education to begin with. But again, when someone graduates with, I think the average in Nova Scotia is $40,000 of debt, that impacts your overall ability to engage in community, in the economy, getting yourself set up and started in life. And we used to subsidize post-secondary in a much different way than we do now. And that really needs to be looked at in terms of what we look at. Even starting to transition our thinking around what the market delivers and what we ought to see as a public service. Certainly, the conversation around internet access has shifted towards, that this is a crucial infrastructure. We've seen certainly the Nova Scotia government expand internet access. It's good for the economy as good as it is for people. We also need to start to reimagine how we distribute food and recognizing that the free market is both inefficient and taking advantage of current situations in that regards. We also need to, again, in terms of when we're looking at poverty, inequality, really expand our systems of education, as well as our pay equity in the private sector, and supports for families who the highest group of individuals who live in poverty in Nova Scotia are single women-led households. There's a lot that we can do to better support families, and that including things like extending more generous parental leave, providing additional income support for folks who are expecting children, and really recognizing, and also the highest group of folks that are food insecure in Nova Scotia are children under the age of 5. Which also, again, really speaks to the need for us to really strengthen our support for families, including, and we have seen this move finally after 50 years, but I cannot stress enough the importance of universal, comprehensive early childhood education, not just for, again, families, but for our whole economy. It is a game changer that's been proven time and time again that universal, comprehensive, not-for-profit childcare leads to better outcomes in terms of learning, education, quality of life, the economy, and anyone who has kids in daycare just knows, I think, the immense skill and love that our early childhood educators have, and that we need to support in a much different way than we currently are. Pay equity, again, we still see women making, I believe it's around 70 or 80% to the dollar that men might make. And this is even worse for when we take that intersectional analysis for racialized folks as well, where again, particularly Black women are paid among the least in Canada at this moment in time when you start to look at equity. So taking that intersectional lens to pay equity and legislating that in labor standards, and ultimately, again, continued and robust support for self-governance of First Nations in the delivery of child and family services, a clear commitment to reconciliation, and support for Indigenous self-determination in the delivery of these social services. So I'm going to put up a next slide on basic income, and I'm sure folks are going to react to that slide. So just before we react, if we can just ask just for an invitation on my critique of basic income. And please note that this is not the position of the college. The college doesn't have a formal position on basic income at this time. This is what I believe to be true and what the evidence has suggested on basic income at this moment in time, which is that it's not the solution that we think that it is. The reality is that basic income is a market-driven idea. It's the idea that if folks have income, that they will be able to purchase by themselves the things that we just talked about, pharmacare, dental care, housing, all of these ideas. And it really is an inefficient and ineffective use of how we look at these issues of poverty and income inequality. Now, saying that, income assistance and income, of course, are important and must be there. I believe that we absolutely have to raise income assistance to the poverty line, but do believe that the narrative of a basic income is a false one because we are not taking into consideration the collective response to these issues. The reality, again, that we are better pooling our resources and providing that wealth distribution in a way that also brings into a component the provision of public services as well, that those transportations, that pharmacare, that dental care, that when we do this together, we're much better off. Basic income runs the risk of recreating a lot of the systems that we already have and driving inequality again as we continue to have many of those public services delivered through the private market, just with people having more income to be able to pay for them. Again, I recognize that there is a strong political movement towards the idea of basic income. But I do believe that it's fraught with challenges. And let's also remember that the original proponents of basic income in Canada were conservatives, under the idea that, again, if everyone had enough income, we would be able to reduce the administration of public services, which, again, is a false narrative in terms of how we tackle income inequality, poverty, and ultimately delivering on the social determinants of health. So I'm sure there'll be comments on that. I'm happy to have this conversation. That is where I land personally on basic income, but I recognize that there are many people with different views on that, which of course are relevant and valid. But I just think that we need to dive a little bit deeper into that language and the narrative building around basic income because it does gut our conversation around the extension of public services, which are essential to delivering on the social determinants of health. I'm going to shift gears. I'm sure there'll be questions on that. And I can see there's chats coming in, and we will look at those and have time to look at that. So I want to shift again in terms of, again, collective responses to the issues that we are facing. Of course, a major social determinant of mental health is housing. And right now we have such an internalized belief that the market is able to deliver on our housing needs. Both the federal and provincial government continue to want to rely on private development and developers to provide the amount of housing that we need. Housing is not simply a supply issue. It's far more complicated than that. And this simple narrative of supply and demand is one that is fraught with just inefficiencies, because your home is just that. It's a home. It's not necessarily a commodity that you're buying, nor should it be viewed that way. Most folks, when they have a secure home, would like to maintain that. And so increasing the supply doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's going to go out and buy a new house or move in that direction. There are a number of challenges in terms of what's happened in Canada with the delivery of housing at this point in time. At the top of that is the financialization of housing, which we don't talk nearly enough about in our public discourse. What we mean when we say that is that housing has turned into a commodity. It is a place for both investors, regular Nova Scotians, to put money in and invest in for the purposes of making money, extracting wealth from housing. This has led again to REITs, which is big investment portfolios that buy up housing, park money there for the purposes of it appreciating. This incentivizes housing for the wrong reason. This is why we say housing needs to be treated as a right with universal access towards a public provision. The reality is that the free market and the market will not ever be able to meet our housing needs because the goal of the free market is to make money, not to provide a public service. So I really think it's important that when we start to talk about affordable housing, and how we get there, there's really a number of approaches that need to be taken. One, curbing the financialization of housing. Again, putting de-incentivizing seeing housing as an investment. And of course, the rapid expansion of non-market and public housing. We also need to transition, and this happens in parts of Europe. We've created a real class divide among those who rent and those who own. And again, most of our housing approaches have to do with everyone owning a semi-detached or detached home, not thinking about the fact that folks rent, that folks need to rent, and that renting ought not to be stigmatized or discriminated against. And so when we talk about public non-market affordable housing, we're also not talking about those as solutions just for the poor. The reality is those are meaningful solutions for all the way up the socioeconomic class. That we, again, when we start to look at mixed market public housing, we're looking at folks in a range of incomes living in public housing, and that we need to rapidly expand our provision of it at this moment in time. We also, of course, need to increase our tenant protections, tenant rights. We've seen some of this unfold with certainly rent control coming into play, and recognizing that we need to do much more in terms of creating a much better balance towards tenants who need rights, and promoting social inclusion and respect in terms of the provision of public housing. We also, of course, when we're talking about housing, need to recognize that the crisis in housing isn't just about even having enough non-market housing or public housing. It is a number of things, including, again, taking a climate justice lens. The reality is that home heating and homes are a major contributor to climate change. And so it's also a huge cost. Ultimately, as we see oil and gas rights raise, building homes that are aligned for the climate sustainability, meeting efficiency targets, and reducing our overall energy consumption is a big part of that housing security. Ultimately, again, living wages, decent work, the ability and capacity to deliver on housing is a core component of that. And greater democratization and accountability, always coming back to, again, the need for all of us to have a say in terms of how we're delivering on core housing issues such as this. So then that leads us into, again, just kind of flowing from how we deliver on these social determinants of health, fiscal framework, looking at how we govern and make decisions, looking at those fundamentals of income and housing, and then the actual services that we put in place around mental health are a core part of this as well. Ultimately, again, what the Canadian Mental Health Association of Canada is recommending at this point in time, based on extensive research, is that if we are to see mental health reach the parity of healthcare, that represents about 12% of total Department of Health and Wellness spending at this point in time. Excuse me. So what we need to do immediately is see an investment of around 120 million and ultimately increase that spending to 362 million within 3 years, which again we can do and can afford. 50% of that allocation of funding needs to go and move away. Not move away, needs to go to community-based care. Again, of our current spending that we do have in place, which is around 418 million, a huge chunk of that, I don't have the exact percentage because the Office of Mental Health and Addictions couldn't precisely tell me, goes to that high level psychiatric care, with less going to that community care where we know we can have a much bigger impact. Ultimately, again, what we need to achieve and what we need to see is at this point in time around $780 million of spending towards mental health and addictions, 50% of that going to community care, and ultimately, again, a real recognition that mental health and healthcare ought not be separated. They are, in fact, all health. Part of that means transitioning how we look at mental health to beyond a medical model, looking more closely at what a biopsychosocial spiritual model looks like, orienting mental health services, again, outside of the diagnosis and medicalized treatment of it, to looking at it from a community perspective and the social determinants of health lens, as we're talking about today. That those fundamental issues of income, housing, community connection, education all play a major role. And of course, ultimately, we need to recognize that mental health care is not a one-size-fits-all. As we talked about when we were describing the social determinants of mental health in our last presentation, that again, it is our socioeconomic, political context that has a bigger impact on our mental health than anything that's going on biochemically in our brains. And so what that means is that different communities experience mental health differently, and so services need to be applied differently. When we look at, again, mental health affecting Indigenous communities, well, again, we know the legacy of intergenerational trauma, the legacy of colonization and residential schools has a huge impact. So again, providing specific services in regards to that. We know, and we saw this week, Naj and I were talking before all of you were brought into the room, about the hatred that is being directed towards the QIA community currently, how they're being scapegoated for many other challenges, and that has a significant impact on mental health. And so recognizing, again, safety, child rights, and of course, provision of services is crucial in terms of that regards. We also, as we talked about last time, recognize that genders experience mental health differently. And so we need to provide care in a way that meets gender-specific needs, including looking at trauma and substance use in a different way. And then we rapidly, one of the things that I think we learned from the pandemic is how important public health is. What we can do when we educate folks on taking a public health approach. We have, again, weak spending on public health. In fact, the last provincial budget, we cut public health at a moment when we should be expanding it. To make sure, again, that there's good services towards understanding trauma, substance use, mental health risks to it, that we're engaging in meaningful conversations, that there's a lot more indication, a lot more prevention happening out there, and towards those ends. Again, we need to develop clear strategies that amalgamate mental health and substance use services. Right now, we've been in the process of separating those. Those need to become much more close together, and recognizing, again, that harm reduction is really crucial in terms of how we resolve issues of mental health and substance use. We saw, I think in 2016, a slight expansion of our Housing First program in Nova Scotia. We haven't seen much more than since that time come on board. Same with harm reduction, although I know we do have some safe injection sites coming online. We've been really slow in terms of providing those services. So again, what I've tried to do in about 35 minutes is articulate where our policy direction ought to be to actually deliver on the social determinants of mental health, where we need to start to unfold and look at our values from a different perspective. And of note is that all of this is achievable when we were involved in supporting the alternative budget put forward by the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives. And all of these initiatives that I just laid out were costed and considered in that alternative budget. And what it did show is that we can very easily afford all of this. There's that notion that we can't simply afford it. The reality is that we can. So that leads us to, so how do we get there? And that is going to be our next presentation in October, is how do we mobilize towards these policy goals, and what does that look like? I see that there are a ton of comments in the chat. Naj, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to open it up to some of those comments or conversations that happened in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. A lot of dialogue and ideas, conversation happening. This is a great time if anyone wants to ask Alec a question. There were some great ideas. I even had one because people were talking about how they're walking around in the city and they see for rent signs with little like other signs right next to it saying investment property. And so that whole notion of housing as investment and not addressing the underlying issues and using that as the commodification, and really also how does that connect to land theft and colonization as a distraction from the fact that this is all part of all of this neoliberal capitalism is part of a larger colonial approach to how we think of home and housing. So there's some great stuff that's happening in the chat. And I think like our members all see like profound injustices, because once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? That's part of the challenge of colonization. They want us not to see it. Now they're blocking the free press because they don't want people to know. Okay, here's Deborah. Thank you so much for bringing us back. So Deborah's asking, what can we do about the fixed term leases? We as an organization and we as individuals. Alec, I am going to take myself off screen because I know you have a lot to say and teach and help us understand even what this means.
Yeah, no, this is a great point. And a major problem right now. I'm going to put a campaign that the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing is running right now on this very issue in terms of what we need to look at. So just to bring folks up to speed, if they haven't followed this story, we have the provincial government did get pressured into putting rent caps in place. And ultimately that was there to protect tenants and to protect major increases in rent spiking. However, they left a bunch of loopholes regarding how leases are formed. And we actually have, when you look at the Landlord Tenancy Act, it obviously very favorably aligns with landlords in this condition. So although we put in a rent cap, we've also seen rent, which is, I think, was set to 5% in the last round of rent caps, but we've seen rent go up 14%. So if we have a rent cap in place, why are we seeing rent jump to 14%? Well, what landlords are doing is they are oftentimes forcing, or not even forcing, just not being transparent with their tenants. This is a fixed term lease. So a fixed term lease means that, again, instead of it going into another term when it's up, it essentially ends the lease for you. Meanwhile, that allows landlords to escape around that rent cap and put up the rent to whatever they want because it's considered a new lease if you're re-signing. So there needs to be efforts to close that gap and that loophole, which some provinces have done. A lot of that, and I'll lay out. I just put the link to this campaign in the chat. You can have a look. But one of the ways that we move around that is automatically at the end of a lease, regardless of if it's a fixed term lease or a long term lease, it's converted to month agreements. That again prevents landlords from treating it as a new lease. There also needs to be, again, much more heavy penalties for landlords who are doing illegal evictions. Again, there needs to be, and landlords actually agree with that point, that there needs to be much more enforcement of even the laws that we have at this point in time, because it's very hard to be able to, either you're a tenant or even a landlord, to have the current Landlord Tenancy Act enforced in that regards. There also, I don't know if folks saw the news recently. I know the news is depressing. One of the areas that I personally found depressing recently is that with all of this tumultuousness within the leasing market, is that folks are having to give up their pets. Again, with landlords doing fixed term leases and then changing the terms, saying you can no longer have pets here, or having the ability to be able to find that. Those are things that again we can legislate. We can remove those additional obligations and remove those different regulations, or improve those regulations to ensure ultimately, again, that connection is really important to our overall health. And again, I know I've spoken a lot about the power of our collective approach. One of the areas that we ought to be promoting and working towards is the unionization of tenants. So that, again, you're not, as a tenant, pit against a landlord, that there's a collection of tenants who, again, can do things like organize to hold landlords accountable. I see folks saying, so to Deborah, there is, on that campaign we just put in place, there is a form letter that you can download and send to your MLA. But I would say that setting up meetings with your MLAs is a really effective way of dealing with this as well. We often believe that our elected officials, that we somehow work for them. I think I mentioned that that's not the way it's meant to work. They work for us. So you can, and they will respond to you. My MLA is Tim Hallman, who I agree with very little policy-wise, but whenever I have a burning issue, he will take a meeting with me and hear me out. And the more times we do that, the more, thanks, Yunaj. We have a tool to be able to help support that as well. And ultimately, again, holding our elected officials accountable is part of our role as citizens and as social workers. So again, setting up those meetings, engaging in those conversations, and the policy points in that Housing is Health campaign are really important to addressing fixed term leases.
So I do want to say that our Social Justice Committee is also working on a letter that hopefully will be ready, and we are looking at also some education around the issue of rent control and fixed leases and all of these issues that are contributing to the housing. But Alec, one of the things that has come up is sort of the ways in which we internalize beliefs in the air and the environment within which we work that talk about market solutions. And I'm wondering if you can say a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the product of growing up in being socialized in a neoliberal capitalist environment. Where we have consistently heard a narrative of government is inefficient, government is ineffective, government cannot solve problems, and that government is a part of the problem. Certainly we see your Pierre Poilievre saying this on a daily basis. There's been a purposeful intent to erode the ability of public services to meet our needs, so that, again, the private market can come and take over and take effect. And we've put it up on a pedestal, thinking that it is, again, the be all end all. Even when we talk about, think about when we talk about the billionaire class right now, particularly in popular media, right? They're not. Rarely do we hear the media talking about how they are exploitative and that the only way to become a billionaire is to exploit or inherit it. And if you inherited it, chances are your relatives were exploiting other folks. We always talk about the billionaire class as being the job creators. These are the folks who are going to, or the innovators. The reality is that most innovation has come from again significant public investments, and the reality is that our public services are very effective at solving problems, and solutions. So what we've done and what we've continued to do I think we're all impacted by it. We talk about how government is ineffective, public services are not going to be able to meet our need. If only I could purchase this myself, or if only there were some individual who could come in and build enough housing for us all. We have to note that in ourselves, in how we view the problems and the solutions that we need to recognize. And we need to, again, recognize that really the only way out of this situation that we're currently in is going to be a collective approach that starts to counter, again, the power of that billionaire class to dictate what our services and supports ought to be.
Thank you so much. As you talk about the neoliberal capitalism, I do feel compelled to also reflect on the ways in which all of this is part of a larger colonial strategy to teach us, that is perpetuated by this systemic violence that causes the intersectionality. So we pick on the most vulnerable. In the chat, there's a lot of conversation around seniors as well, disability. There's so many different people at the margins of society who are not being able to access that. And that's part of the strategy that we pit against each other. And now we saw it this week with hatred towards trans and gender diverse folks, as opposed to thinking about how do we protect all humans. If we cared half as much about housing and poverty as we cared about grammar and toilets, we would have a much better world. Right. And that's where we just need to keep doubling down on social justice and advocacy and the social determinants of health. Yes, we have, the numbers are over 1,000 folks living in tents that have been counted. And this is part of the fragmentation of the social fabric, right? These are the wedge issues that divide us. And so coming together with the collective good, for the safety of all humans, involves ensuring that our government voices are heard. And that's where we have created that guide. And that's where Alec is saying, reach out to your MLA, even if you disagree with him, because his job is to represent you. And in the same ways, our social justice committee and all of our committees are only as good as the people who volunteer. So too, all of the nonprofits and all of the organizations and our elected leaders, which is why we've been partnering with the Legal Information Society of Nova Scotia to give people that toolkit. But those individual letters are important, but it's even more powerful when we link our arms, not just the social workers, but we are linking our arms with the College of Physicians, with the Dalhousie School of Medicine, with the Doctors Nova Scotia, with the psychologists, with the occupational therapists, we are all stronger together. If we all speak together, that's our advocacy day. That's what we're trying to build. And our next one, we're hoping will be this March as part of Social Work Month, because that's what we do. We are connectors as social workers, right? We're connectors for the public good. And that involves strengthening our collective voice and our democratic institutions so that they can represent each of us, especially the most marginalized and vulnerable. The other thing that's coming up in the chat, thank you so much, is the issue of air conditioning as our climate is demonstrating huge changes, and also the issues of heat that's killing people. So it's a very complex and nuanced conversation. It is, of course, climate change is absolutely related to the ways in which we disrespect the land upon which we are. So perhaps that's an excellent note to end on. As we are reflecting and preparing for the month of October, where hopefully we will have a chance to ground ourselves in the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings of this unceded land where we are, so that we can show our commitment to truth and reconciliation, to justice and healing on an intersectional level for all people. Thank you all, every social worker, everyone who's joining us, for everything you are doing to keep people safe in a world that is programmed and designed to keep us unsafe. We are building safety, and I believe in us because we can link together with all of the amazing Indigenous communities, the Mi'kmaq communities that are here, whose land we are on, and we can amplify that message that we are all united, even if people are trying to divide us. Thank you, Alec, for teaching us, for giving us all of these like very important structural policy components that I can barely even give justice to. So I learned so much from you. I learned so much from each of you because my thinking has been decolonized since coming to unceded Mi'kma'ki and meeting the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. Each of you, the critical thinking that you've been doing through your education at Dalhousie University has been really profound. And shout out to the social work department there because you are also unsung heroes. Grateful to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.